Today, we're taking a journey back to the late 70s, when video gaming was just on the cusp of being revolutionized with the invention of home consoles. It's 1977, and Atari is getting ready to unleash a machine that would become the cornerstone of the gaming industry for years to come, the Atari 2600. This system brought arcade classics into the home and laid the foundation for what we know as console gaming today. Join us as we dive into the history of the Atari VCS, how it came to be, and its lasting impact on gaming culture. So plug in that joystick, pop in that cartridge, and get ready for another trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 210th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are turning the clock back to 1977 to talk about the Atari 2600, a console that revolutionized home gaming. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who once spent an hour trying to dodge those damned asteroids. Just an hour, he got bored afterwards. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, did you ever manage to blast your way out of that one?
Yeah, once you turn the power off, you're free to go.
That's what it took. Not any skill learning the game, just I'm done. I'm out.
I mean, you win either way.
You win either way is a fantastic way to put it. Fantastic way to put it. All right. Well, today we are talking about an Atari. Have you ever had an Atari in the house?
Um, hmm. I don't know the answer to that because I feel like we do, but I never played it.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I can't say for certain. Dad would know better than I would.
For sure. Well, before we talk about how the Atari came to be, let's talk about some of the other things that happened during this week in gaming history.
Alrighty, well, kicking it off, on September 4th, 1985, Capcom released Ghosts and Goblins for arcades in Japan, a game that would go on to become one of the most iconic and challenging titles of its era. Players took on the role of Sir Arthur, a brave knight tasked with rescuing Princess Prin from the evil Demon King Astaroth. Known for its unforgiving difficulty, Ghosts and Goblins required players to navigate through multiple levels filled with relentless enemies and tricky platforming sections, all while managing limited lives. The game was praised for its colorful graphics, eerie atmosphere, and memorable music. Despite its steep difficulty curve, or perhaps because of it, Ghosts and Goblins became a beloved classic, spawning numerous sequels and adaptations across various platforms and securing its place as a legendary title in video game history. We covered its origins back in episode 97, so if you want to learn more about it and its creator, Tokuro Fujiwara, give that episode a listen.
Yes, indeed. You gotta play the game twice. I think that's what I named the episode. I have to do this twice.
That does sound familiar. I think that you're right on that.
Mm-hmm.
On September 3rd, 1998, Konami released Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation in Japan, marking a pivotal moment in the action-adventure and stealth game genres. Developed by Konami Computer Entertainment Japan and directed by Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid follows the story of Solid Snake, a retired soldier called back into action to infiltrate a nuclear weapons facility and neutralize the terrorist threat posed by Foxhound. The game was praised for its intricate narrative, cinematic presentation, and innovative gameplay mechanics, including stealth based tactics, advanced enemy AI, and complex boss battles. Metal Gear Solid set new standards for storytelling and game design, earning critical acclaim and commercial success worldwide. Its impact on the industry is profound, influencing numerous games and establishing the Metal Gear series as one of the most iconic franchises in gaming history. And we learned all about its history back in episode 158. So go check it out.
That's a fantastic game. That was such an important game for that generation of gaming. It genuinely is one of the more influential games of all time. So if you don't know its story, go back to episode 158, give it a listen.
Yeah, do the thing.
Yeah, do the thing.
Yeah. Next up on September 7th, 2007, Midway Games released Stranglehold for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows. This third person shooter serves as a direct sequel to John Woo's 1992 film Hardboiled and features Chow Yun Fat reprising his role as Inspector Tequila. The game blends intense gunplay with Woo's signature acrobatic stunts and destructive environments, developing a cinematic action experience. Stranglehold received praise for its stylish gameplay and faithful representation of Woo's film style, though it did not achieve significant commercial success. Despite this, it remains a cult favorite among fans of action games and Hong Kong cinema, highlighting the potential for games to extend cinematic narratives.
Yeah, games that play within cinematic universes are always fun. Like that was a good one, and the games that worked around the Matrix movies were good ones. So that was all fun stuff.
Could we argue that games like The Force Unleashed and Fallen Jedi Fallen Survivor and all of that would play into
Yeah,
cinematic
y-
universes?
yeah, for sure. For that matter, the Marvel games too.
Oh yeah, honestly, I forgot there were Marvel games. Except for Spider Man, but I wasn't thinking Spider Man.
Spider-Man was fantastic.
All of that. Honestly, it's one game franchise. Anywho, on September 6, 2011, Techland and Deep Silver released Dead Island for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Microsoft Windows. This action role playing game is set on the fictional island of Banoi, where players find themselves in the midst of a zombie apocalypse. Dead Island combines first person melee combat with open world exploration and RPG elements, allowing players to choose from 4 different characters, each with unique skills and abilities. The game's focus on brutal, visceral combat and its cooperative multiplayer mode, where up to 4 players can team up to survive, were particularly well received. Despite some technical issues at launch, Dead Island was praised for its immersive atmosphere, engaging gameplay, and the depth of its crafting system, which enabled players to modify weapons to fend off the undead. The game became a commercial success, spawning several sequels and expansions, and maintaining a strong following among fans of the zombie genre.
I actually really enjoyed Dead Island, and was the second one Riptide? I still
That's
haven't.
I believe because I believe you got me the second one, and that was my introduction into it, and it was interesting to me, but
I've
not really for
never.
me.
I've never played it multiplayer, and that might change it. We still have to play Dead Island 2, which is a Game Pass game. So
Yeah, well, it's amongst the other million zombie
I
games.
know so many games to play.
So many. Last up, we have on September 6th, 2017, Bungie and Activision released Destiny 2 for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, with a subsequent release for Microsoft Windows. Holy shit, it's been 7 years. Wow.
Yeah. No.
This,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got to consider the whole story. I mean, the whole thing from 1 to 2 was 10.
okay, you're right.
But yeah, you're right.
Jeez. This online old wow. This online only multiplayer first person shooter is the sequel to the 2014 game Destiny and expands on its predecessor's universe. In Destiny 2, players take on the role of guardians, defenders of Earth's last safe city, who wield powerful abilities derived from a mysterious force known as the Light. The game features a rich narrative campaign, cooperative modes like strikes and raids, and competitive multiplayer modes in the Crucible. Destiny 2 received praise for its improvements over the original, including a more accessible storyline, refined gameplay mechanics, and enhanced graphics. The game has continued to evolve with numerous expansions and seasonal content, maintaining a dedicated player base and solidifying its position as a major title in the multiplayer shooter genre.
Good game.
Speak for your yes. Some people enjoy it, definitely.
I liked it. It didn't grab me or keep me for 7 years, but I probably got a good year out of it. Got a couple years out of the first one. I enjoyed playing Destiny for sure.
I really enjoyed the first, but for some reason could not get into the second. So I don't know. I don't know what it was.
It happens.
Absolutely. But with that, Dave, I think it's time for us to talk about today's topic, the Atari.
The Atari. While studying electrical engineering at the University of Utah, Nolan Bushnell worked a part time job at an amusement arcade as a carnival banker, right? Where he became familiar with electromechanical games. He watched over the place and helped maintain the machinery, which really helped him gain an understanding on how this type of business worked. And so, with doing so, he gets this idea for a pizza parlor with animated scenery and animatronic bears that also had games for the patrons to play while they waited for their pizza to be made.
Hey, we just talked about Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yes, Freddy's Pizzeria, aka Chuck E. Cheese's.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. So Nolan graduates in 1968 and he gets a job in San Francisco at a company called Amprex. There at Amprex, he's assigned to an office with Ted Dabney, and the two become fast friends. During the same period, he joins a club that meets to play the board game called Go, and there he meets a man named Jim Stein. Now, Jim was a researcher on Stanford University in their artificial intelligence project, and Stein introduced him to a game that they've someone has created there called Space War. And Space War is played on the mainframe in Stanford. And so one day Nolan goes to visit Stein and has an opportunity to play Space War while he's in the lab. Now, we covered Space War really early on in episode 31, one of the early video games that we know of. So go back and listen, long time ago. Playing Space War here, though, brought Bushnell back to his days working in the amusement arcade. And it left him with the firm belief that an arcade version, a portable coin operated version, like the amusement arcades he was used to, a version of Space War, would be incredibly popular. So he takes the idea back to Dabney, and the two get to work on a prototype version of the game. Funny enough, the story goes they kick Dabney's daughter out of her bedroom, move her into the master bedroom, and then like knock down a wall so their space becomes the largest room in the house, and they turn it into like a sprawling lab where they do all this electrical engineering stuff to find out how to manipulate the TV signal so they could make colors and shapes appear on the screen.
Hmm. So when you use the term portable, it just means that it can move from location to location. Not when we think portable, like you can just take it on the go and play it. Because right.
No, so at the time, these games were only played on mainframes that would literally take up the space of a warehouse nowadays. So to be able to create a electrical device, so to speak, that could be literally put on a dolly and wheeled into an area was for them a portable alternative to the mainframe computers. So
Okay, that makes a lot more sense because when you said portable at first, my mind went to like a 3DS or something, and I'm
now,
like, why would you just have that in your pocket and put a coin in it to play? That's kind of stupid. You get the coin back at the end unless you have to ship it off to the damn manufacturer.
no, what they envisioned was an arcade cabinet before there were arcade cabinets. So they cleared her daughter out of the area, turned it into a lab, and they got to work learning how to manipulate TV signals to kind of make this happen.
I mean, hey, the daughter got the master, so good for her.
And what they ended up doing was they turned Space War into an arcade cabinet called Computer Space. And while doing so, they invested in themselves, each I think $250 or $350, and they put the money together to start a partnership, an engineering firm called Syzygy Engineering. And once they had this working and a prototype and a working idea, they turned to an arcade manufacturer, someone who had typically been involved in the electromechanical arcades, but was just starting to get into video games. I mean, frankly, everyone was, right? There were no video games. We're talking like they had made a trivia electromechanical game, so to speak. The arcade manufacturer was called Nutting Associates, and they turned to them and said, "Hey, we have this idea to turn this game into a arcade cabinet to put into these amusement arcades. What do you think?" And Nutting Associates was on board. So Syzygy Engineering worked with Nutting Associates, and they built what we now recognize as the first commercially available video game, which is Computer Space. We've touched on Computer Space before, kind of when we did the Space War episode, so we've visited this concept in the past. Now, Computer Space wasn't very successful. There are reasons for it. People didn't understand it. It was a game that you really had to read the instructions on the machine before you stepped up to it. There are reasons now in hindsight we understand, but at the time, Bushnell felt that Nutting Associates really did little to help market their product. In fact, they really only put it in bars, which was primarily where Nutting Associates did business with their other machines, like trivia machines and other electromechanical machines, like pinball machines, right?
Yeah,
So the team at Syzygy starts looking for another partner, and they find one in the pinball manufacturer, Bally Manufacturing. But the catch is that Bally said, "We'll do business with you, but you have to cut things off with Nutting Associates." So they do, right? They terminate their relationship with Nutting, and Bally offers them $4,000 a month for the next 6 months to design a new video game and a new pinball game. So they're in business, right? They have income coming in, and so they hire one of their other office mates that they shared an office with at Amprex, Al Alcorn, who became their first design engineer. And so this story has varied throughout history, but we kind of know now through court documents and such that the settled version is that in May of 1972, Nolan Bushnell saw a demonstration of the Magnavox Odyssey, the very first home console. And on the demonstration was the tennis game that came with it. So he came back to Syzygy and he asked Al Elcorn to produce an arcade version of the tennis game, which would become their first hit, Pong. In Bushnell's mind, one of the problems with Computer Space was that it was too complicated. So when he saw Magnavox's tennis game, he saw its simplicity, that they could turn into a game that would be successful. So they turned that concept into Pong. And while they're working on Pong, which was to become their first actual game, they decided that it was high time to incorporate as an actual business, which they hadn't done yet. And so when they went to do so, they found that the name Syzygy was already taken. So they're looking for a new name, flirting around with things, and then Bushnell gets an idea. He goes back to his board game club, back to the one that brought him to Stanford, the one that brought him to Space War to begin with, and he thought that a move in Go, the game that they played this club, was a pretty interesting name for their company. And that name, of course, we now famously know as Atari.
What was an Atari?
An Atari is in Go when you only have so in Go, like if you get surrounded by something, you lose the piece. It turns colors, right? That's the way you play Go. It's also known as Othello, right? You ever play that?
All the time. Oh, all the
Yeah,
time.
okay. So let's assume that you're surrounded on three sides, but you can move in one direction. That's called an Atari. It's the equivalent of a check in chess, right? Where you're like caught, but you have one move to get out of it. You know what I mean? So,
You would have more than one move potentially.
but that's the equivalent.
Yeah.
Like
Okay. All right.
amateurs at Go will call out an Atari the same way someone calls check in Pong. You know,
Check and pong. Got it.
check and Pong, check and Go. Sorry, check and Go, not Pong. Check and
Check
Go.
and chess.
So it's basically when you have a series of moves with one way to get out of it, essentially. So Pong is released in November of 1972, and it is recognized as the first truly successful coin operated video game. We know this. So now Atari is in the business of making video games, and they continue to do so after Pong. They meet their commitment to Bally. They make game. They open up a pinball division. We covered Atari's pinball division when we did the episode on Defender and Eugene Jarvis. So if you want to learn more about that, go check out Eugene Jarvis in the Defender episode. They weren't very good at making pinball games. That's my disclaimer. That's my little teaser, so to speak. They get in the business of making video games. At some point in there, they make the decision, as everybody did, to compete with Magnavox and their Odyssey by creating their own Pong home console. So, as they're designing the home console, their Pong, they're really realizing the limitation of video game design, or the limitations of it for design at the time, in that all of the arcade cabinets use a bunch of individual chips, individual logic chips that are all printed on a large circuit board. We've covered that in multiple episodes about Breakout and the driving episode. Literally, some of these arcade cabinets could have hundreds. I think there was one that literally did have hundreds of logic chips. And Breakout, for instance, is famous because that was work done by Steve Jobs and Wozniak. And Steve famously brought, it down to an absurdly low number of logic chips and got Woz got the bonus and kept it from Steve Jobs. That's the way the story goes. So
Oh, so you stole the work for he stole all the credit for work that other people did.
yeah, that's essentially how that goes. That's the
Hmm.
Breakout episode. Go check it. The Breakout episode was crazy, right? Because it had Wozniak, it had Steve Jobs, it had who was the Supreme Court Justice, the lady that passed away.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah, it had Ruth Bader Ginsburg in it. I mean, that's a weird episode with a lot of cool people in it. So go check that out. So they're designing their home consoles and they're kind of realizing the limitations because the Magnavox has logic chips in it, right? And they realize that the home console is really made possible by a new technology called large scale integration. And large scale integration is essentially where they can take all these different pieces. I think large scale is more than 4,000 or maybe like 2,000 to 4,000 transistors, because after that it becomes very large scale, like integration, right? Did you learn about that? Am I even in the ballpark?
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, sure.
Yeah. So large scale integration is when they can basically take all of these components that were on a large circuit board and they can integrate them into a singular, much smaller microchip. Large scale integration is essentially one of the most technologically significant creations or inventions of the 20th century. And in turn, it's directly responsible for the creation of microprocessors for computer chips. Computers that once took up all the space in an entire home could now be manufactured on a small chip. So, in 1974, Atari acquires Cyan Engineering. They are an electronic company that was originally founded by none other than a few other of their coworkers that worked at Amprex. That was a happening place apparently. And they had worked on a few arcade cabinet ideas with Atari, so they already had a relationship. And in doing so, they had expressed an idea to their Atari brethren, their partners, that consisted of making a new powerful home console that was powered by a microprocessor. One that was going to be able to play all of Atari's arcade games. That was the start. We want to be able to recreate all of your arcade titles in a small home console. But at the time, microprocessor technology would cost them anywhere, the microprocessor itself would cost them anywhere from $100 to $300. And as that's only one part of the console, they knew that adding the rest of it, putting the rest of it together, was going to make their idea of a home console just ridiculously unaffordable for most people. But microprocessor technology was new and it was being worked on, being refined, and prices were coming down. There were companies that were making announcements and working on scaling this concept up to the point that would make the cost of these chips come way down, right? So they first approached Motorola, who had just unveiled their 6800 processor, and they began to negotiate with Motorola to use the 6800 microprocessor. Then in September of 1975, a company called MOS Technology debuted their 6502 microprocessor at the Westcon Trade Show in San Francisco. And it had a price tag, an advertised price tag of $25. Now, they were very, very, very similar. In fact, many of the engineers who designed the 6502 for MOS also worked on the Motorola 6800 project. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, the MOS 6502 processor, if you remotely grew up during this period playing video games, was probably behind most of your childhood. No joke. It powers the Acorn line, the Apple I, the Apple II series, all of the Ataris, the 2600, 52, 7800. It powers the Atari 8-bit computer, the Atari 800, their handheld, the Atari Lynx. It's also found as the chip for the Commodore 64, the Commodore 128, the BBC Micro, the TurboGrafx 16, and the Nintendo Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System.
I recognized about three of them.
The MOS chip, that the line, not necessarily the 6502, but that line of chips powered a lot of computers, a lot of, basic computing stuff in this early microprocessor age. So it got
I
around.
mean, shoot, at $25.
It gets even better. So the associates from Cyan are at this trade show, right? And basically they meet with the MOS people with the knowledge. Their understanding is that even a $25 chip was going to make their console a little too expensive for what their idea was. Like they had a price point, right? So they get to work and they negotiate with the MOS people. And the MOS people say, hey, we have this cost reduced version of the 6502 chip. It has less memory register pins. We're calling it the 6507. And the people who at Cyan, the Atari people with Cyan, they basically are able to negotiate a 6507 alongside an input output chip, which we call a Riot chip, RAM input output, uh, at $12 for the pair of them.
Wow.
So
That's a hell of a
success.
bargain.
That is a heck of a bargain. Well,
300
MOS.
to a little under $12.
Well, but that's how fast the technology was progressing as people were learning how to scale it up, right? I mean, there's no chance that MOS was like, "Hey, we're going to lose money on this." They probably didn't make much, but they weren't losing money. So, as part of that deal, Atari wanted another source of the chipsets just in case. So their contact at MOS introduced him to a friend of his who co-founded another company called Synertech, who provided that. So they were able to negotiate past that. And also at the trade show, they were introduced to a company called Microcomputer Associates. Microcomputer Associates had just produced a low cost computer called the Jolt, which had the 6502 in it, which they used to test the 6502. And as part of that test, Microcomputer Associates had developed debugging software and hardware. And that already designed platform for debugging the stuff that you're making on that chip is going to be incredibly useful to Atari who want to use those MOS chips moving forward, right?
Yeah, I would say.
So, with all the pieces in place, Atari announces in October of 1975 that they're moving forward with the MOS chip. And this was a complete surprise to Motorola, right? Their sales team had already told management at Motorola that it was a done deal. So management was not happy with this announcement. Now, remember how I told you that many of the engineers on the MOS project also worked on the Motorola project? Well, no surprise, the following week, Motorola sues MOS, claiming patent infringement and misappropriation of trade secrets. 4 MOS engineers were named in a lawsuit, all people whose names were actually on the Motorola 6800 patent application. The court did find, in fact, that one of them, at least, brought 6800 design documents over to their new company. And this court battle goes on and on and on. But after a while, it was clear that, MOS wasn't getting anywhere and they were running out of money fighting this behemoth. I mean, Motorola is just huge. So they finally decided to settle. They agreed to drop another chip in the line that was very close to 6800, the 6501. They agreed to pay, I think it's $200,000 to Motorola and return the documents that were taken from the company, the trade secrets. As part of the agreement in the future, both Motorola and MOS agreed to cross license multiprocessor or microprocessor patents, so that benefited everyone.
You know, with stuff like this, like obviously someone moved from one company to another, like they helped design that. Like, how much different can you make it at the time? Like,
I know.
obviously, other manufacturers, it's basically you can't monopolize that kind of stuff. I mean,
Well,
you can, but
I think the sticking point was actually taking the documents with them.
that's the part of it that I can understand. But like, if you help design this microprocessor, and then you're like, hey, I'm going to this new company, and like, hey, so I helped design this microprocessor. Here, like,
And when I say similar, like specification wise, they're incredibly similar. Like clock speeds and memory registers and like they're very very similar. But I mean, you're right. Consider the time period. Like technologically, that's where we were.
yeah, I just it's one of those. Even now, like I have been in a business that has allowed me to see a lot of companies that were founded by people who left another company and make specific crosses to the equipment from the manufacturer they left, and it's like, yeah, it's basically the exact same thing. But like, because how different can you make it? Like, a surge protector is a surge protector. You can change some of the things, but like at the end of the day, there's not that much you can do.
I agree. I agree, which was definitely the case here. So the companies settle. Soon after, Motorola drops the price of their chip to $35. And MOS, looking for money, basically has to shop the company around, and they end up selling the company off to Commodore. Commodore's parent company, Commodore Associates or Commodore International, purchases MOS. And they do continue to license that chip out to other companies. They didn't buy it and keep it for themselves. They bought it and basically used it to make money. No surprise. So Atari goes out and with this, all the pieces are together, the hardware's in place, right? And they decide it's time to move on with this project now that we know what the hardware is going to be. So they make another hire, a guy named Joe DeCure. He's a recent graduate from the University of California, Berkeley, who had been doing his own work on the 6502, and that caught their attention. They brought him in. So alongside the team at Cyan Engineering, which is technically they're Atari employees now, but that's the easiest way to distinguish them. Those guys are Steve Mayer and Ron Milner. They all start work on prototyping this home console, which starts off as Project Stella. which is named after the brand of DeCure's bicycle. He rode a Stella bicycle to work, so that's
I
where
thought
it
it was
comes from.
beer.
What's that?
I thought it was based on the beer.
Oh, nice. So the very first prototype of Stella, which is, if you ever want to see it, it's currently on display at the Computer History Museum. It contains a breadboard level design of the graphics interface alongside the 6502 chip, as a work in progress. Actually, 6507 chip, I should say. That's what they ended up with. So, in time, Ron Milner would take that breadboard and he would turn it into what's called the TIA, or Television Interface Adapter. And there are programmers who worked on the Atari in that area who call the TIA the secret sauce to Atari's home console. So, explain what the TIA did. Whereas most graphic chips in the modern age, and even back then, once they became a little bit more advanced, have a frame buffer. It's basically a little bit of memory where the computer writes what's essentially a single frame of what it wants to display on the screen to the frame buffer, which then sends it to your screen. The Atari did not have a frame buffer in any way, shape, or form. Frankly, it was an expensive technology at the time, and it just wasn't going to work with their cost, right? So, what the TIA does, Rob, and this is so freaking fascinating, it basically syncs up with the electron gun in a cathode ray tube TV. So as the ray tube, as the cathode tube scans across rows on the TV, the graphics are generated in real time by the TIA as the television itself scans through its lines. And this is actually really cool because this ended up being a way that Atari programmers would really do some interesting things. They would manipulate the system by doing something that they called racing the beam. And that would be where they would program their games to perform other functions while the electron gun was scanning outside of the visible screen. So, a side note, if you're ever wondering why some Atari games don't fill the entire screen, why there are black bars around Atari games, it's because that's the programming time. That's the time that it's performing functions of the game. Now, the second prototype of Project Stella ran off of MOS's 6507 chip. It included the TIA, the secret sauce, and a ROM cartridge slot. So, with the hardware in place now, with the second prototype, it's time to design the physical console itself. And to do that, Atari brings in a man named Gene Landrum. Gene had just finished working with Fairchild on their Channel F console, which was the first console to use cartridges. We covered the Channel F story in episode 114. So if you'd like to learn about the very first console that ever used cartridges, and also a really interesting, its designer is a really interesting man, go give it a listen. And Landrum basically said, his notes make the cartridges idiot proof, child proof, and capable of resisting potential static electricity that might be found in living rooms everywhere. Aside from that, you need for your console to fit into modern living rooms, which at the time meant giving it a wood grain aesthetic. Landrum also suggested including dedicated games in the console itself on top of the ability to use cartridges, but that idea was scrapped. So, in order to design said cartridges, Atari also went to the team that worked on the Channel F, and they literally hired the engineer that designed the cartridges for Fairchild.
Nice.
His name was Douglas Hardy. Douglas worked alongside a man named James Asher, and they designed a cartridge that fit the requirements. It was sufficiently different enough to avoid patent conflicts, but it borrowed from the characteristics that they used for the Fairchild Channel F that protected it from static electricity. Now, as all of this is happening, Atari as a company is making a series of mistakes that have caused the company as a whole to struggle financially. Throughout 1974 and 1975, they're making games, of course, but there are a bunch of missteps, like they tried to expand into Japan without understanding the market and the rules and regulations, and they lost a buttload of money. And their pinball division had a lot of failures, and just there were reasons why they were struggling. So 74 and 75 were really rough years for Atari. Like during that period, something like half of the staff had to be laid off. So they're throwing basically all the resources they have left into this project, into Project Stella. And as they're nearing completion, they realize that they just don't have enough money to push into the home console market. So Bushnell starts to explore options to make that happen. He considers making the company public, which it wasn't yet. He reaches out rather to MCA and Disney, trying to get them to buy the company. Neither one bites. No one's interested. Finally, in November of 1976, after some negotiation, they accept an offer from Warner Communications for $28 million. Now, to put all the time frames into perspective, it's during this period when Atari is negotiating with Warner that the Fairchild F is actually released to the world, which is why Atari kind of got beat to the punch with their own cartridge based console, because they were trying to maneuver these other things that were happening, while this is all going on. So Warner officially acquires Atari, Warner Communications. If you now go and look at Atari ads from this period, you'll see in, Atari, big whatchamacallit, and on the bottom, Warner Communications. And Warner gives Atari $120 million to finish Project Stella. They were all in. They were all in. And that gave Atari all the money it needed to get the console finished by early 1977. The unit is showcased on June 4th, 1977 at this Summer Consumer Electronics Show, with plans for a retail release in October. Fun little side note, after Pong was released, Magnavox sued Atari, and they, for patent infringement, all that. There was a court case. I think we talked about it in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg episode, because that episode talks a lot about copyright infringement and how they came to that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a part of. And as part of the settlement over that lawsuit, they had to agree. Atari had to give Magnavox the technical information of all their products from June 1st, 1976, and the agreement ended on June 1st, 1977. So they purposely waited until after that deadline was up, so they wouldn't have to share the technical specifications of their new Atari home console with Magnavox. And that's exactly what they advertised. They planned on releasing in October. They got ahead of schedule. So Atari releases their video computer system, or Atari VCS, in September of 1977. They, at the time, had no inkling whatsoever that they were poised to take over the world. Rob, do you know what else is poised to take over the world?
What's that, Dave?
Podcasting. For those of you that are looking to get into podcasting but just don't know where to start, our friends at Zencastr have created an all-in-one podcasting suite of tools that makes it easier than ever to create your own podcast.
With Zencastr, it's super easy to record a podcast. Everyone logs in using their web browser, and you just start recording a high quality podcast right away. It allows you to record up to 4K video with your guests, and with Zencastr's multi-layered backups, you always have the highest quality recordings, even if your connection is unstable.
And with Zencastr, you never have to worry about what you sound like. Zencastr's post-production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes all those ums and ahs, removes those awkward pauses in conversation. You can set the right podcast loudness, reduce background noise. You can do it all with a single click of a button.
And if the thought of podcasting overwhelms you because you think you need tons of different tools and services, relax. Those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute it to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations.
So if you'd like to start your own podcast, or maybe you're looking to take your current podcast to the next level, we've got a deal for you. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencastr paid plan.
Sign up for Zencastr today And you can experience the same ease in producing your own high quality podcast as we do each week. Go out and share your ideas with the world.
So the Atari VCS ended up being a great idea that Atari shared with the world. It was released in September of 1977, came with two joysticks and the Combat video game cartridge for $199, which to put into perspective is the equivalent of about $1,032 today.
Wow.
So it was not an inexpensive technology by those standards. But considering that microchips at the time were $300 when they started, it could have been even worse, you know?
Yeah, very true.
During those last few months of 1977, Atari is said to have sold between 350,000 and 400,000 units. In 1978, they're said to have sold only about 550,000 of the 800,000 consoles they manufacture, so they had to turn back to Warner Communications for more money. It was about this time, in response to this, that Warner went back to, or Bushnell rather, went back to the Warner board of directors and basically said, look, the VCS is nearing obsolescence. We should start working on whatever the second version of this is, the VCS 2. We need to work on what's next. And the board of directors basically said, nope, we've invested too much money in this concept. We're going to focus all of our marketing and everything on this. So in response to that, that's when Bushnell noped out of the company and left. But the VCS lived on. It sold about 1 million consoles in 1979. And even though that sounds like a lot of numbers, it was nothing compared to what came next. So it was around this period that Atari obtained a license from Taito to convert Space Invaders to their console. That version, Space Invaders, is actually the first officially licensed arcade conversion for any home console. And it released in March of 1980, which ended up doubling console sales for that year. So Atari sold 2 million consoles in 1980. After realizing how popular that was, licensing titles became a thing. And Atari's, home console rocketed in popularity. It kept doubling year over year over year for the next few years. By 1982, Atari's best-selling game was Pac-Man. They had sold just over 8 million copies of Pac-Man and just over 10 million consoles in the United States alone. And just to put the amount of money into perspective, because I love this weird stuff. Making the system in 1982 cost Atari $40, and the price by that point was down to $125. So they made $85 with every console they sold. The cartridges cost Atari $6 to manufacture. Let's say they threw another $2 into marketing. So $8 to make a game that sold wholesale for $19. So they made $11. Let's round it down to 10 on each game sold. So if Pac-Man sold 8 million copies, it made $80 million in profit, split between, the licensee and Atari. And that's just one game. That's just one game, right?
Wow.
There was so much money to be had here. The VCS was insanely successful. Insanely successful. So in 1982, Atari is finally ready to announce the follow-up to the VCS, which was going to be called the Atari 5200. In order to standardize naming, they renamed the VCS to the Atari 2600. That number, both those numbers, are derived from its manufacturing part number. The VCS's part number for the manufacturing was CX2600. And by the end of its run, which was finally discontinued along with all Atari products officially on January 1st, 1992, Atari had sold about 30 million Atari 2600 consoles. So, real quickly, there are some variations on it if you're ever out there looking at Atari consoles that I think you should know about. The original production line, like the 1977 production line of Atari VCS consoles, was made here in the States in Sunnyvale, where Atari is, and it uses thick plastic because they didn't want to give people the wrong impression about what was mostly an empty shell, because frankly it was. The inside of the consoles were mostly empty, right? Just has a chip, a board in it, circuit board, So they originally used thick plastic. But by 1978, to reduce cost, Atari moved production to Taiwan, and the Taiwan versions use a thinner plastic with less metal shielding, so it's lighter. Affectionately, these comparisons are we refer to them as the heavy sixers and the light sixers. In 1980, two of the switches were moved to the back of the console, so any version from 1980 on has four switches on the front instead of six. And in 1982, when they announced the Atari 5200 and they rebranded the VCS to the Atari's 2600 officially, they ditched the wood grain look, so Atari 2600 are all black. Aside from this, you might find the Sears Video Arcade, which is the Atari 2600 made specifically for Sears. It's identical to the Atari VCS/2600. It just has the name Sears Video Arcade. Same console, different name. There was also a Japanese only version that was released soon after the Famicom came out to try to get in on that market share. It was called the Atari 2800. And then again in 1986, again to capitalize on the upswing because the NES exploded in popularity, they released a cost reduced model that had a smaller form factor. It had ads that said something like "Fun is back again," the had the video game crash and now we're back in business type deal. And that cost reduced model, which I think was like $50 by that point, it's affectionately called the 2600 Junior. I had other stuff I want to talk about, but Rob, there's always so much to talk about in these console episodes, especially with iconic ones like the Atari and the Famicom. We always kind of run pressed for time. So I'll summarize it, cut some of it short. In case you were wondering, the top 10 games for the 2600 are as follows. Demon Attack sold 2 million copies at number 10. Number 9 is Miss Pac-Man at 2.3 million copies. Number 8 is the famous E.T. game that crashed the market in 1983 with 2.7 million copies sold. We did a whole episode on the video game crash of 1983 and all the reasons that it happened, not just because of E.T., so go give that another listen. 7 is Defender with 3 million copies sold. 6 is Asteroids with 3.8 million copies. 5 is Frogger with 4 million copies. 4 is Pitfall with 4 million copies. 3 is Donkey Kong with 4.1 million copies. 2 is Space Invaders with 6.2 million copies. We've already talked about Pac-Man, which sold a little over 8 million copies. So, IGN once said, I tripped on this as I was researching for this episode, that the Atari 2600 is the console upon which our entire industry is built upon. And in all honesty, I'd have to agree with that sentiment, right? It brought arcades into our homes. It made video gaming affordable for the average household, you know, in an in-home experience. I mean, not that arcades weren't affordable, but it brought those arcades home and made it affordable. It's the console that took the arcade experience, what it was designed to do, wrapped it up in a tiny package that you could bring to your home, and then mass marketed that concept. It showed the world that games could be played at home, showed the world that licensed titles could be incredibly successful, and basically gave us the formula for how this should all work. And it's funny because not only did it give us this incredible boom explosion of video game sales, but it also brought the industry to a crashing halt when it contributed to the video game crash of 1983. But even there, what it gave to us were the lessons that we all learned from that experience that have improved our industry since then and gave it the staying power that it needed to be, I mean, let's be honest, forever relevant. It's probably never going to go away at this point. So, yes, if you're not familiar with the Atari 2600, it is an incredibly important console for gaming history and for modern gaming itself. It is literally the building block upon which we all have to think at this point. So, if you never had an opportunity to experience any of this, there is a game out there called the Atari 50 Collection. It was made last year for Atari's 50th anniversary, and it is easily as a video game historian and fan of nostalgic gaming, the best collection of video games made for this purpose that I have ever had the pleasure of encountering. It is like a real living, breathing museum in which you can also play the exhibits. Literally, it has a game and it has a copy of the marketing materials that you can zoom in and look around, and it has the actual instruction manual, and you can change the dip switches from the arcades and all the games. And then if there were commercials, it has commercials. If it was a historically significant game, it actually has interviews. It has interviews from the people who made the game. It is amazing. So if you're a fan of what we talk about week after week, and you've never had an opportunity to experience the Atari 50 collection, and you want to learn more about Atari, that time period and everything, it covers Atari from its arcade beginnings, literally with Space War, all the way up to the end, which was the Atari Jaguar. It's got a little bit of all of it. Really focuses on the arcade and the Atari 2600, but it's an amazing collection. So go check it out. It's a great opportunity for you to experience a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, all in one little package. And I mean, it when it goes on sale, it's like $25. It's not a big investment whatsoever. So yeah, Rob, get the Atari collection
Yeah,
since you
sounds
since,
like it's definitely something to try out.
since you've never played Atari.
Well, I played Atari games. I just haven't played or owned an Atari.
True
It's a little,
statement.
little different.
Well, this was an episode that has a lot of other branches to it, right? We talked about Space War, we talked about Pong, we talked about Eugene Jarvis and the pinball, and I mean, just it is absolutely everywhere. It touches on bits and pieces of a lot of other stories that we've told in our 210 episodes of this podcast. So, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the place that you can go and get all of these other episodes. First, of course, anywhere you listen to your podcast, but most importantly, our website, www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, where else can what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episodes, see what we are going to be discussing in the future. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come hang out, talk with Dave and I, and some other people in our wonderful community. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited versions of each of our episodes. You can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. Be about a game, a console, people. We talk a lot about all the companies that bring everything together. Just whatever I find relevant to the current week in gaming history. While doing so, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, of course, we covered the Atari 2600. Every week, when I sit down to do my research for a new episode, one of the things that I look for is things that I don't know, because I believe that it's fun to learn new things. And chances are, if I don't know it, Rob's not going to know about it. And a lot of the people that listen to this aren't going to know about it because we have a slightly above average knowledge of video games. And when we can add to that, it's great. So, in celebration of this cycle of teaching and learning, which we love so much, every week we like to talk about what we've learned and our takeaways. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think my favorite takeaway is just how quickly the cost of the microcontrollers. I mean, we started out at 300 for a single one, and then we're down to $12 for one with the Riot with it. I mean, that's just it's incredible. And I mean, granted, the cost still you said somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000, so it's not like it was cheap by any means. But I mean, just imagine if it was still at that $300 price point. There's no way it would have been successful. So it just goes to show how major advancements in technology can not only help improve the games, but can ultimately really reduce the cost for the consumer.
Well, isn't that kind of the pillar upon which this entire industry has boomed the entire time? Every jump in generation is largely due to essentially more processing power somewhere, right? Either in the CPUs themselves or the graphic chips themselves, like when we made the jump to 3D polygons and then now into photorealism, like that power comes from somewhere. And that has been largely a result of continuously changing processes, their ability to literally this large scale integration to integrate more transistors into the same size chips keeps increasing, and more computing power means more technology for us to play with, which means advancing what we do, right? So that
Yeah.
concept that's our industry. Our industry has hinged on that advancement starting here in 1977, and just it's never stopped. It is still the concept today. Don't get me wrong, we've hinged ourselves on some other stuff like faster, well, even a faster hard drive has to have a controlling chip that allows it to access memory faster, right? So that even that applies. Literally, that's the concept upon which everything we do is a thing. So that's what I have to say about that. So
Yeah. So that's it for me. How about yourself, Dave?
I loved learning about the TIA and how it synced up, how it worked, and actually listening to programmers talk about how they cheated the thing and raced the beam, and how that was like they would feel such an immense source of pride and accomplishment when they figured out how to do something, because to a lot of them the Atari 2600 was such a brutal like machine. Like it was so limited in terms of its hardware, and having to learn how to make things in that environment and the tricks and everything, like it was fantastic. So learning about how that worked with the programming and all the workarounds they did, it's so interesting. It's one of those things I didn't get to talk about. Like we could do an episode just on some of that. You know what I mean? So I loved learning about the TIA and just that revelation that occasionally they would add a few extra bars of like a few extra parts where the screen was black, and that was to give themselves more time to do the programming behind the scenes. Like that was like an epiphany for me. Like that is so cool to think about, that's what they did. That it was that simple, you know.
No, that is pretty awesome.
I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that little tidbit to learn about the TIA. So it was really fantastic. All right, well, we're not too far over time for today, so that's a good place to call it. Rob, before I take it into next week, is there anything else that you'd like to add to today's episode?
As always, I want to take one quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along as we dive into all of these old gaming topics, whether it be consoles, games, the people who created them, whatever it might be. So we hope you enjoy learning about these alongside of us, and we appreciate you coming along every time. So thank you.
Indeed. All right, folks. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Atari 2600, the console that started it all, laid the groundwork for the gaming industry as we know it today. We've explored its origins, we've talked about some of its iconic games in terms of numbers, and we've really talked about its lasting legacy here towards the end. The Atari 2600 might be a relic of the past, but its impact is felt even in the consoles we play on today. Next week, we'll take a look at how a small orange marsupial became the face of PlayStation in the mid 90s, the innovative development behind the game, and we'll talk about we'll talk about how Crash Bandicoot is still such a beloved character. So grab your Wumpa fruit and prepare to jump, spin, and slide with us on yet another trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Dooba doom dap 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 doo ba da